Hello, my name's Adrian Goldberg and welcome to the Week in Politics here on the Byline Times podcast. The Byline Times is what the papers don't say, what radio doesn't report and what telly doesn't tell you. This week, Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister. We'll be assessing what his new cabinet tells us about the direction of his government. We'll be discussing his decision to shun the COP27 climate summit in Egypt and the ongoing stalemate in Northern Ireland's Assembly at Stormont. We'll be joined by Byline Times political editor Adam Bienkov and our investigations editor Sam Bright. First, though, just a reminder that the Byline Times podcast is funded by subscriptions to the Byline Times, our brilliant monthly newspaper, which has exclusive content that you can't read anywhere else. We can report without fear or favour because there's no billionaire or corporation telling us what to say. Our funding comes from ordinary subscribers, people like you. So if you can, please subscribe to the Byline Times. You get more details over at bylinetimes.com. Subscriptions start from as little as £3 a month. Though, as I say, more details at bylinetimes.com. Welcome then to Adam and to Sam. Adam, an article you've written about Suella Braverman returned as Home Secretary in Sunak's first cabinet. That article's gone viral. Tell me about it.
Yeah, so obviously we got a new Prime Minister this week, and his first big decision was to pick his cabinet, who he wants to be at the top of government. And there are a lot of familiar faces, a lot of people from the Truss era, also brought back a lot of former ministers from the Johnson era as well. But there was a number of appointments which raised eyebrows, including Gavin Williamson, who has been brought back, and he was famously sacked by Theresa May after being accused of leaking information from government. But more tellingly, perhaps, was the reappointment of Suella Braverman as Home Secretary just 6 days after she had been asked to resign by Liz Truss for inappropriate use of government information, leaking it essentially to another MP and somebody she believed to be an MP's wife. This was a breach, actually two breaches of the ministerial code, the cabinet secretary decided. And so she had to go. But as we understand it, some kind of agreement was struck up between Braverman and Sunak over the weekend when he was looking to get enough nominations to clinch the leadership contest. The end result is that he agreed to overlook the fact that she just resigned from government and brought him back in. I can understand the sort of raw politics of bringing her back into the government, but it doesn't look great, particularly when you've just stood on Downing Street saying that now is the time to bring integrity and accountability back into government after a long period under Truss and Johnson where those issues were called into question, and then suddenly bring somebody who has had to resign in disgrace just days before.
And the circumstances of that resignation have been called into question as well. Braverman said that she effectively blew the whistle on herself, but Jake Berry, Conservative Party chairman, has said, no, she didn't, that somebody else blew the whistle on her. So questions about her honesty and integrity have been raised as well, not to mention her views on deporting asylum seekers to Rwanda, which she has said she dreams about.
Yes, and it's questions asked about exactly what she did raise and when she raised it, because those claims by Braverman were repeated by Rishi Sunak in the House of Commons on Wednesday. And if that isn't true, as it looks like it is not, then he has potentially misled the House on his first outing as Prime Minister. Downing Street being very reluctant to answer questions about that all this week, essentially refusing to answer questions about what he knew and when. This is turning into what was an embarrassment for Sunak at the start of his term into something potentially more serious. And with more stories coming out, there's another story came out last night in The Sun suggesting that some of the information that she leaked was market sensitive, reports of other breaches. I mean, she's known within government as Leaky Sue. So it does seem to be a recurring problem here. I think this is potentially turning into something more serious for the Prime Minister. And I can't see how it's sustainable. I can understand why he's resistant to ask her to step down, to have her suffer a resignation so early in his premiership would look pretty terrible for him. But I just can't see how he's going to turn this around. If I was him, I would be trying to persuade Suella Braverman to resign off her own back. All she needs to do is come out and say, look, I'm becoming a distraction for the government. It's time for me to step down. But as we speak, neither she nor Downing Street seem willing to bend on this.
Sam, some commentary suggests that Suella Braverman is in the cabinet in order to appease the right wing of the Conservative Party, particularly the hardline ERG group. But if you look at Rishi Sunak's past, you could argue that he is himself allied very much with the right wing of the party. That's one of the reasons for his ascendancy. He was an early adopter of the Leave campaign, and he knows well her views on immigration. She proposes, in line with the Conservative manifesto of 2019, that net migration should be reduced. This was a point of tension between her and Liz Truss, who saw migration into the UK as a means of generating economic growth. So is Sunak doing this to appease the right, or is he himself of the right?
Well, I think this just speaks to the modern Conservative Party. I'd say, on the one hand, Rishi Sunak is very right-wing. Some of the things you've outlined there suggest it. He voted in favour of Leave, which famously Liz Truss didn't, despite Liz Truss being seen as more of a Brexity option in the summer's Conservative leadership election. And, Sunak supported an economic agenda that goes hand in hand with Brexit. He doesn't seem a keen advocate of the sort of interventionism that was proposed by Boris Johnson. He seems more in line with the libertarian philosophy of Truss. He's written papers for Tufton Street think tanks in the past, exalting free ports as the way forward, the post-Brexit innovation that will propel growth in this country. And free ports essentially propose reducing taxes and certain regulations in particular areas of the country, which is a classic free market view. I'd say that Braverman, though, represents, and the ERG, as you suggest, represents an even more right-wing iteration of the Conservative Party, which does exist, which is really hardline on immigration, is quite aggressive towards Europe and asylum. I think this is actually a relatively new feature of the Conservative Party, how its hostility towards asylum has been rolled into its anti-immigration tone, which has emerged since 2016. And like you say, that is Braverman's agenda. And Sunak wants to unite the party, and part of that is bringing her in the fold.
And we've seen this week reports about an asylum centre in Manston in Kent, which has been dangerously overcrowded, according to officials. And of course, it's not easy for the Home Office to have to deal with migrants crossing on boats. There are logistical problems associated with that, and also arriving from other areas as well. But it's clear that this has not been, shall we say, wholeheartedly embraced by the UK government, with the result that people who are supposed to stay in a centre only for a day or two are having to spend weeks there in overcrowded conditions that are frankly shocking for a sophisticated modern country.
Yeah, this is the thing. I think the government's approach towards asylum seekers has been poor and borderline appalling for a number of years. I remember investigating back in 2015, 2016, the massive amounts of money that the government is forced to pay out every year because it unlawfully detains asylum seekers in removal centres. So administratively, in terms of the institution of power, the government in recent years has always behaved badly towards asylum seekers. That, I'd say, before the past few years, has been counterbalanced with a generally supportive, sympathetic rhetoric towards asylum seekers and Britain's place in the world in offering them protection. Now, we've seen Nigel Farage campaign quite aggressively about small boat crossings. That has sort of become his hallmark post-Brexit campaign. And that, in many ways, has been assimilated by the Conservative Party, who've tried to, prevent Nigel Farage getting any further foothold on the right of politics and eliminating a portion of the Tory base in the way that we saw, from 2014 onwards. And so you've seen institutionally, a very hostile attitude towards asylum seekers, now combined with a hostile rhetoric towards asylum seekers as well, which is a pretty miserable position to be in.
Yeah, the Chief Inspector of Borders and Immigration, David Neal, said he was left speechless by the wretched conditions at Manston, extreme overcrowding, and staff he said, who are not properly trained to do their jobs. Adam, to return to Brexit and what Rishi Sunak believes, one of the consequences of Brexit, and he was in the cabinet which struck the deal, is the Northern Ireland Protocol, which effectively creates a border in the Irish Sea between Britain and Northern Ireland, a border which the Conservatives said would not be there. That's the reason that the DUP are effectively causing the Northern Ireland Assembly in Stormont to be frozen. How is that being perceived in Westminster? Do people care, apart from those small number of MPs from Northern Ireland?
Well, we do have this bizarre situation in the United Kingdom generally, where so much of what happens in Northern Ireland essentially doesn't really get an audience in the rest of the UK, but it is incredibly important and a very delicate situation there. The Assembly has not functioned now for 4 of the past 6 years. And we have a situation now where one party in Northern Ireland is effectively holding this democratic process to ransom, boycotting it. And it's impossible to see how they're going to get through that. We now know that the government had held up the prospect of holding new elections for the Assembly in order to sort of intimidate the DUP into compliance. And it hasn't worked. I mean, actually, the DUP believe their hardline stance on this could actually help them in that election, despite the rise of Sinn Féin. I don't really see a way through this. Brexit has obviously made the bad situation much worse in Northern Ireland. And it's something we should be talking about a lot more in the UK. But it's just, as I say, it's not really getting a hearing in Westminster at the moment.
And one of the practical consequences of this is that spending which is allocated to the Northern Ireland government can't always be spent. So people who are on hospital waiting lists, people who need help with their energy bills, for example, are finding that help isn't always available because it's not simply a case of, oh, well, Stormont isn't doing it, Westminster will do it. Some of these spending powers are devolved and do not default back to Westminster in the meantime.
Yeah, I think exactly. I mean, these are issues that are really affecting people's lives in Northern Ireland. And I think there is just a sense that unless events in Northern Ireland are directly affecting the rest of the UK, and obviously we saw that when the peace process has broken down in the past, it just doesn't really get a hearing. But, you know, it's a sizable chunk of the United Kingdom, and it's important that this is resolved. I think with some credit to the government, their rhetoric on this issue does appear to have softened a bit, even under Truss, as compared to the Johnson era. Steve Baker, formerly ERG stalwart, who just styled himself as the hard man of Brexit, his rhetoric has actually softened a great deal on Northern Ireland as well. So I think the will is certainly there from the UK government to find a solution to these difficulties. I'm just not sure that there is actually a solution to be found at the moment under the current terms of the Good Friday Agreement and under the current Assembly as it stands.
No, well, that's the key question, isn't it? Because if we do have a de facto border in the Irish Sea, the DUP are not going to be satisfied. So the only way we get rid of that de facto border, it would seem from the outside, is to scrap the Northern Ireland Protocol. But that will then have huge ramifications for the UK's relationship with the European Union. Talking about major ramifications, Sam, Rishi Sunak has decided not to attend the COP27 climate summit in Egypt. And many people, the UK government will be represented, it should be pointed out, but many people are saying that this is a sign that Britain's commitment to net zero is not as wholehearted as they would like us to believe.
Indeed, and this is perhaps one of the ways in which we should give credit to Boris Johnson's administration, is for all of its rhetorical bluster that wasn't matched with substance, and this was potentially one issue as well. He was very committed to the green agenda. There was a great deal of pride, I think, and of institutional investment in the COP26 summit, which was held in Glasgow last year. And now there seems to be a large degree of backsliding from this administration, which is peculiar. It does seem to be sending out mixed messages on the climate for whatever reason. Perhaps it's party unity purposes, as we discussed earlier. But Sunak indicated earlier in the week that he would reverse the decision to lift the ban on fracking. So essentially to ban fracking again. And now he's come out and not only has he said that he won't be attending the new COP summit in Egypt, but also he's demoted two key environmental representatives from the cabinet. So Alok Sharma, who's the COP president, who, like you say, will be one of those people who'll be representing Britain in Egypt. He doesn't have a cabinet spot anymore. Neither will Graham Stewart, the climate minister. So this isn't just a one-off, which I guess you could understand. Lots is happening in the domestic economy. We're all clearly concerned about energy bills, about rising cost of living, and we want the Prime Minister to be really knuckling down to fix that, which I think does, it has a climate element to it as well. We want him to invest in renewables, which will then reduce our bills. But this, like I say, it seems to be a trend. It seems to be a pattern amongst the Sunak administration, even in these early stages, that he's not perhaps taking the climate as seriously as his, I was going to say predecessor. Boris Johnson was obviously one before his predecessor.
And of course, this is a week when Shell has announced massive profits. And we've had this weird situation, haven't we, whereby the chief executive of Shell, it seems, has almost been inviting the government to impose a greater windfall tax on the company. Now, it should be said, much is made of the fact that the company has not paid tax on its earnings. That is partly, in fairness, because the company has offset those earnings by reinvesting their profits into green energy.
No, it's not necessarily into green energy. This was a loophole that was inserted in the windfall tax back in May by the then Chancellor Rishi Sunak, now Prime Minister, which was that companies could offset what they were due to pay on the windfall tax if they renewed in extracting any type of energy. So it can be fossil fuels as well. It's not restricted just to renewable energy. And as a result, as you say, Shell, despite having near record profits just generated, did not pay anything towards the windfall tax, which is a remarkable situation, really. All of this comes at the same time as we have a UN report now saying that there's no credible pathway to keep the rising global temperatures below the threshold of 1.5 centigrades rise, which, is a pretty bleak assessment. And the government, as Sam says, is really sending out mixed messages on this. Over the summer, during the leadership contest, Sunak was actually quite strong on the environment. He often raised the example of his two daughters, saying that the one issue that they really cared about was the environment, and he was deeply committed to it. But not only is he not attending the COP27, not only is he demoted his climate change representatives in cabinet, he's also recommitted himself to banning the generation of new onshore wind farms in the UK. That's a sort of not long-standing, but it was in the last Conservative Party manifesto to ban on new onshore wind generation. But it does seem a bizarre policy for someone who says they're committed to tackling climate change. Actually, these things, onshore wind, just like solar farms, which Liz Truss was also opposed to, are very popular with people. The polling that has been done on this shows that around 80% of people are in favour of new onshore wind being built. But it does seem that there is this conflict within the Conservative Party between those like Boris Johnson, who see that we have to be on the right side of history here and we have to tackle climate change and get behind this, and the sort of NIMBYism and sort of anti-green agenda of many on the right of the party. And it doesn't seem like Rishi Sunak is quite clear which side of the divide he sits on at the moment.
Yeah, we've seen mayors in Northern England, people like Andy Burnham in Greater Manchester, Steve Rotherham on Merseyside, Tracy Brabin in West Yorkshire, trying to seize the initiative in terms of developing green energy. Rishi Sunak himself, and I know this because I've read it in a fantastic article at bylinetimes.com, written by Max Colbert, part of the Byline intelligence team, he's received £141,000 from individuals and companies with financial ties to the oil and gas sectors. And you don't have to be that cynical to be aware of that fact and then learn that he's not going to COP27 and say, how sincere is he really about a green agenda when his funding comes in part from these fossil fuel interests?
Exactly, and it's a complicated business, this question of funding, because lots of these people who've donated to Sunak, they have corporate interests in many different fields, not just energy. They may have donated out the goodness of their heart or their political ideology, which just happens to be the same as a Tory Prime Minister who isn't doing a lot on the environment, or has signalled that he's not going to do a lot in his first week. But the fact is, the waters are made more murky by the fact that the Conservative Party, especially in recent years, allows access to ministers from these donors. So basically, in exchange for large amounts of money donated to the Conservative Party, it allows those donors to have the ear of power. So there's what's called the Leaders Group, where if you donate £50,000 a year to the Conservative Party, in whatever form of that central party, to candidates, etc., then essentially you're allowed to dinner parties with ministers. If you've donated £100,000 or more, and this was in Boris Johnson's era in government, you were allowed to join what's called the Downing Street Advisory Board, where essentially you have exclusive access to Downing Street ministers, advisors, and the Prime Minister himself or herself. So it's not simply that these people have given money and, there may potentially be some sort of influence. They are allowed through the structures of the Conservative Party to influence those in power. And I think that's why it's particularly concerning.
And Adam, as you say, the United Nations Environment Programme saying there is no credible path to limiting climate change to a 1.5 degree increase in temperature.
Well, I think there has been a sort of sense among a lot of politicians over recent years that they were willing to put off big decisions on these issues. We think, this is going to be happening. We're going to see these problems in maybe 20, 30 years, 50 years even forward. But look around us now. We're having record temperatures, I believe, this month, floods throughout the summer, wildfires. People are seeing with their own eyes the impact of the climate crisis and can see that it's getting worse year on year. And I think there is a real risk for Rishi Sunak and the Conservative Party generally that they're getting on the wrong side of this, wrong side of history. And we need to act now, because this isn't just a climate crisis. It's not just about the environment. It's about all of our security as well. This is if there's rampant climate change and sea level rises coming upon us, then people are going to be. It's going to become an immigration crisis. The issue with small boats is going to be absolutely dwarfed if there are parts of the world that are suddenly under sea, and it's also an economic issue. We're looking for growth. We're told that the government is dedicated to finding growth. One of the biggest growth areas in the economy is renewable energy. Why are we not investing huge amounts of money in renewable energy rather than actually putting bans on things like onshore wind? It's just on all of these areas, I think the government is fundamentally on the wrong side of history. And I think Johnson, to his credit, did see that. But it does feel like we're really going backwards under Truss and now under Sunak as well.
These contradictions run all the way through our main political parties. I don't think this is unique to the Conservatives, but you think about what that word means, to conserve. There is arguably no greater duty, if you are a Conservative, than to conserve the planet on which you live. There is also arguably no better use for public money than investing in renewable energy, which will make us energy independent, less prone to be blown by the course of international events like wars in Ukraine.
I couldn't have put it better, Adrian, really. And I think, to be fair, there is a body of consensus within the Conservative Parliamentary Party for, a more Johnsonite view of the climate. And perhaps this comes back to what we were discussing earlier, that Sunak is being swayed, he's being pulled rightwards due to a political compulsion of his to appease the hard right in his party. Unfortunately, that section, that slither of politics has proven to be effective in recent years, from 2016 onwards, and has been particularly effective in swaying Conservative Party members towards a more radical view of society, climate, economics, and is therefore pulling the body of thought within the cabinet in that direction as well. Yeah, your point about conservatism as an idea, as a principle, we could also see that in terms of Truss. Her economic views were essentially, slash and burn. Everything's awful. It doesn't matter if we burn it to the ground in the process. That's kind of a similar strain of thought that runs through multiple different spheres of policy making currently, rather than the sort of stability and fiscal responsibility that the Conservatives were parroting in the Cameron era.
Adam, I've seen some polling today that suggests that Sunak's personal rating is slightly better than Keir Starmer's. The polling I've seen suggests that if there was an election today, the Conservatives would still lose by a landslide to Labour. But Sunak himself has a high public approval rating and is more trusted on the economy than Keir Starmer is, perhaps because people have seen him already in the role of Chancellor. So you don't need any kind of leap of faith or leap of imagination to see him there. But I suppose it just reminds us of a conversation that we had a few weeks ago, that Labour have got to stand for something more than simply being an alternative to the incompetence of the Conservatives. Because if the Conservatives stop being incompetent under Sunak, then what else have Labour got?
Yes, well, I think we have to be slightly wary of the sort of early polling. I mean, a lot of this polling has been done sort of in the days when he's been taken over, and I think some of it's quite mixed. I think one poll I saw, he was somewhat behind Starmer in approval ratings, but not by much, it's fair to say. But he was slightly ahead, I think 1 point ahead on who would make the best PM. I think Sunak is really benefiting from simply not being Liz Truss. I mean, Liz Truss's personal approval ratings, I think by some measures, were the lowest of any prime minister since polling began. So simply by not being Liz Truss, I think he's inevitably going to be benefiting from that. I think the problem the Conservative Party has is that although his own approval ratings do seem, they are a lot better than Liz Truss's were, the Conservative Party's ratings don't seem to be catching up with him, certainly not yet. There's been a slight bump in some of the polls post him becoming Prime Minister, but they're still 20, 30 points behind Labour, which would still be a wipeout for the Conservative Party. And I mean, you say, the risk for Labour is that the Conservatives stop becoming incompetent. Well, that certainly hasn't been the case in the first few days of Sunak's term, certainly with the Suella Braverman appointment. But undoubtedly, it is the case that he is a much slicker performer than Truss was, and arguably that's not particularly hard. But Prime Minister's questions this week, I think both Truss and actually Johnson wasn't particularly good in the House of Commons either. I think Sunak just simply by standing up and reading out some pre-agreed rebuttal lines against Starmer, just by virtue of doing that, managed to exceed what were quite low expectations about how he would do. But again, the substance of his performance at Prime Minister's questions, I don't think was that great. His attack lines against Starmer seemed to be largely borrowed from Johnson, particularly trying to mock Starmer for being from North London, which never particularly worked for Johnson, I didn't think, but certainly don't work for Sunak when he himself owns a £6 million Mews mansion in Kensington and another £1 million flat nearby and a manor house in Yorkshire and a £5.5 million penthouse apartment in California. I don't think trying to paint Starmer as being out of touch, an elite politician, really works for him. So he did okay, and I think people are willing to give him a chance, in large part, I think, because there's a lot of goodwill towards him internationally and domestically as well for being the first British Asian Prime Minister that we've ever had. I think that's understandable. So I think people are willing to give him a shot. It doesn't really change the fundamentals, which is that the economy is really bad. The public believe that that's at least in part to blame by the Conservative Party, including himself when he was Chancellor. I don't think being a bit of a slicker performer and not being Liz Truss is going to be enough to suddenly start seeing leads in the polls for the Conservative Party. But I think your basic point that the Labour Party can't just rely on the government and the Prime Minister being useless, as they did to a certain extent with Truss and Johnson, I don't think that's going to be enough to guarantee them a thumping victory in the general election. I think they understand that as well, but I'm not sure they've quite got their attack lines right on Sunak yet. They're sort of not sure whether or not to attack him for being rich, or whether to attack him for being weak, or being the same as Truss and same as Johnson. It's a little bit all over the place at the moment. I guess that will come with time. They're not quite sure how to deal with Sunak at this point.
No, interesting point you make about him being the first South Asian Prime Minister of this country. Had a really fascinating conversation with Michael Bankole about that. Michael is an academic who has investigated race and representation in UK politics. You can hear that conversation on the Byline Times podcast and read a version of it over at bylinetimes.com. And you can read much more from both Adam Bienkov and Sam Bright over at bylinetimes.com as well. If you're enjoying the Byline Times podcast, if you want to support these two fine journalists, then please consider taking out a subscription to the Byline Times. You get a fantastic monthly newspaper, but in addition, you are helping to support the work of this podcast too. So thanks very much indeed. This has been The Week in Politics. I'm Adrian Goldberg. We'll see you again next week. Cheers now. Bye-bye.